first smattering of rain stirs the red ground, tracing worn lines through scattered rocks. A dull fog begins to gain momentum. Wrung out from Pacific storms, life in Rough and Ready Creek follows the contours of the canyon. Its headwaters gather at the base of fractured ridgelines that divulge their unseen reservoir out of a leaking network of underground channels and seeps weaving across the edge of the Kalmiopsis wilderness. Against a backdrop of sparsely vegetated terrain that could be mistaken for a misplaced piece of desert in this wet corner of Oregon, water is released from this labyrinthine system to pool in boggy wetlands that shelter life and persist through the scorch of late summer. Many of the trees and plants in Rough and Ready Creek are uniquely adapted to this niche of extremes, scratching out a living from thin soils over arid months that are bookended by a wet season that can yield over 100 inches of water in a year. A steep ascent leads to ridgelines that plateau above deeply incised riparian corridors. Along a thin wrinkle of rock, storms drain either west into the adjacent Kalmiopsis wilderness or east into Rough and Ready Creek's 23,000 unroaded acres. Underfoot, ripples of tectonic collisions that folded oceanic crust in deeper mantle layers into the present crumpled topography are felt in the serpentine terrain. Further radiating out of these grinding geologic impacts is a biological richness of flora, a blossoming emergent from the rust-colored ground and the varied paths taken by species to sustain life and the unique mineralogy of peridotite soils. Following the slope to the canyon bottom, the descent leaves a regenerating conifer forest before alternating between swampy terraces blanketed in Darlingtonia and clumpy woody shrubs on the way to the water's edge. The Red Canyon is creased with gullies that funnel any spare water down its steep sides. Rough and Ready Creek itself maintains a benchmark clarity even after heavy rains, despite the frequent presence of easily eroded clays. Along stream sides, intact stands of Port Orford cedar shade the water between the banks, surviving in the absence of roads or trails that could act as pathways for the introduction of fatal Port Orford cedar root rot disease. Downstream, the shoreline undulates between vertical walls and flat cobble benches. Rapids form where the channel narrows into boulders sloughed off in landslides from the shoulders of the canyon, where in drier months, chaotic currents subside into slackened water, punctuated by deep pools that provide a refuge for cold water fish species. In the calm of an eddy, a watery lens creates the illusion of flying. Hovering over rocks at an overhead depth, they're magnified to seem within reach. Tributaries continue pouring off the elevated plateaus, adding force to the quickening flow. The power of the water dissipates in long arcing turns as the confines of the canyon walls begin to loosen. Rocky debris carried downstream piles in a cobble delta that spills out from the canyon mouth across a wide floodplain. At the ends of unraveling channels, currents seep below ground, regathering along the line of the valley's slight tilt. Scattered Jeffrey pine and native grasses sprout out of clefts between the rounded stones. The stunted forms common in species here and throughout the watershed illustrate the intractable problem of living in a serpentine landscape. While a plant might succeed in staking out a hermitage for itself in the infertile soil, the bargain made for its solitude rules out an easy life. This watershed is a recursion in wildness, iterations of water over stone folding deeper into the hillsides. A restless line through this pathless place. Rough and Ruddy Creek is the freest branch of an untamed system. For the life rooted in this cradle of rock, this is the last refuge against the accelerating changes around it. Here, this is a landscape of resiliency, a mosaic of uncommon geology and the rarer plant life that it supports.